When you think of Alcatraz, one of the things that probably doesn't come to mind is children. But surprisingly, there were a lot of kids living on the rock while the infamous federal penitentiary was operational. That's because about half of the prison staff lived on the tiny island with their families. At any given time, there were about 60 families with around 75 children living just a stone throw from some of the most dangerous criminals in the world. The maximum security prison opened in 1934 and was designed to house prisoners that were deemed too troublesome for other prisons. The fact that it was on a small island, surrounded by the cold and dangerous waters of the San Francisco Bay, added an additional obstacle for any prisoners trying to escape. The families who lived on Alcatraz initially lived in an apartment building called Building 64. Additional apartment buildings were built in the 1940s. These apartments offered sun decks with amazing views of the San Francisco skyline. There were also some cottages and houses on the island for officers, with the warden's house located right next to the main cell house. For the most part, all of the civilians were kept on the southern part of the island. Even though 2/3 of the island were off limits to the families, the kids living on Alcatraz had plenty to do and enjoyed most normal childhood activities. They had a playground that was like a community hub. They could go fishing and crabbing in the bay. Chuck Stucker, one of the children that grew up on Alcatraz, said, "The fishing was great and you didn't need a license and there was no limit." Stucker also said he got access to restricted areas to fish with the help of his fishing buddy, the warden's wife. There wasn't much grassy area for the children, but they did have space to do things like play baseball. And another popular activity was roller skating down the roads on the island. They would race each other in soapbox derbies. There was also a social club for the families that had a bowling alley, dance hall, soda fountain, and other amenities. During the holidays, the kids would go trick-or-treating and sing Christmas carols. Sometimes, some of the older boys would get together to sleep overnight by the water, which was very much against the rules. There was also a small convenience store for the roughly 300 civilians living on the island. The children would have to take a boat to and from school in San Francisco each day. On stormy days, if the waves were too rough, the warden would declare a school holiday. Children who lived on Alcatraz had an ID card that they had to show every time they arrived or left the island. The kids of Alcatraz mostly speak fondly of their time on the island and the tight-knit community that was created amongst the staff's families. Obviously, there were some strict rules that had to be followed. 2/3 of the island were off limits to the kids. When they wanted to have friends over, they had to have them approved by prison officials first. The children weren't allowed to play with toy weapons on the island, and they would also have to go through metal detectors when returning from school to make sure they weren't sneaking in anything that a prisoner could use as a weapon. They also couldn't throw certain things that could be used as weapons in the trash, like metal forks or broken glass, since the prisoners would pick up the trash. And the number one rule was never communicate with the prisoners, and the prisoners had the same rule. But there were a few instances where there were some interactions. The prisoners would sometimes wave at the smaller children, and they would wave back, but once the children got older, that was not allowed. There's a story about one of the prisoners passing a small handball through a fence to one of the kids, and another story of one of the children who was receiving medicine at the island's medical clinic, running into Alcatraz's most famous prisoner, Al Capone, and shook his hand. The prisoners would do some work around the island, but always under a guard supervision, so encounters between the prisoners and the children were extremely rare. There are no documented situations where the children were ever threatened or harmed by the prisoners. The families living on Alcatraz said for the most part they felt very safe and comfortable on the island, with most not even locking their doors at night. But there were a few instances where that safety was tested. On May 2nd, 1946, a group of inmates in an escape attempt were able to overpower guards and gain access to firearms and keys, exchanging gunfire before U.S. Marines landed on the island and restored order. Families living on the island were evacuated to the mainland during the ordeal. The incident resulted in 5 deaths, including 2 guards and 3 inmates. Another scare happened on the morning of June 12, 1962, when 3 inmates, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Angelin, vanished from their cells, setting off siren screams across the island, waking up everyone from their sleep. If there was ever an escape, the children had a responsibility to immediately check places like under their beds and in all the closets to make sure no prisoners were hiding in their homes. Not sure if that was the safest procedure, but regardless, that's what they did. The 3 inmates were never found. Most people think they drowned trying to escape, but there's no definite proof either way. Not long after the breakout, Alcatraz closed. It became too expensive to run. Alcatraz was turned into a landmark, visited by more than 1 million tourists every year. I did the tour a while back and highly recommend it. Most of the apartment buildings where the families lived are no longer standing, but Building 64 remains. Even though the prison closed and all the families moved off the island, the children that grew up on Alcatraz would still meet up once a year to talk about their time on the rock. Thanks for watching. As always, I appreciate it. Please subscribe for more historical videos. Take care.